Hello, my wonderful, beautiful friends, guys. Welcome back to r/ProRevenge, where people get sweet revenge on those who've wronged them. And in today's episode, it's all about bad landlords getting what they deserve, guys. And a sleazy landlord goes to war against a lawyer and regrets it big time. Guys, I hope you enjoy the stories. Subscribe if you're not subscribed. And as always, you can send or link your post to this email right here. Let's dive in. Landlords are a-holes, generally speaking. Everyone knows that. But if you think residential landlords are bad, they're nothing compared to commercial landlords. Landlords of commercial buildings are some of the cruelest, nastiest people I've ever come across. This revenge tale is about a commercial landlord and how I dealt with him. So back in the 90s, sometimes I would go for lunch at this restaurant in the basement of our building. The place was called The Vault because it had a massive bank vault that had always been there, dating back to the days before the place was turned into a restaurant. The vault was so huge that they could seat a couple of tables in there, and you could eat dinner surrounded by rows of old, gleaming safe deposit boxes. One day I was there for lunch and the owner took me aside. He said to me, "The landlord is driving me nuts." To which I respond, "The landlord drives everyone nuts." I was a subtenant in the same building. I shared the space with an older lawyer named Aaron, and the landlord was always causing us trouble. I already had a few run-ins with him and we hated each other on site. In most jurisdictions, commercial landlords do not need court orders to get you out if you're late with rent. Instead, they just change the locks, and when you find out about it when you show up and your key doesn't work. Every time our landlords had a dispute with anyone, which was often, he would always threaten to change the locks. The landlord tells me he keeps demanding all this stuff for extra rent, and it's really weird because a lot of it is really old. The restaurant owner showed me a letter the landlord served him earlier that day. I looked over the demand and read a list of expenses for snow removal and parking lot repair and common area flooring. All kinds of crap going back years. I read it all the way to the end, and there it was. The usual clause saying that he was going to change the locks if the tenant did not pay this and do that. I say to the owner, "From the wording of the demand, it looks like you've been fighting a while. Why did you wait before consulting a lawyer?" He said to me, "I asked one of the lawyers I know and he said it's hopeless." He told me the lawyer's name. It was a guy I knew with a crappy real estate practice, who'd resorted to taking legal aid classes to keep the lights on when the market tanked in '89. I asked him, "Did you do something to make the landlord hate you? Because this is a bit over the top, even for our a-hole landlord." The owner tells me he knows I'm moving the restaurant, and I think he's trying to grab as much money as possible before I go. Plus, he's giving me grief over the vault. I respond, "He won't let you take it with you?" The owner says, "Are you kidding? It weighs almost 100 tons and I don't need it. But the lease says I have to remove it and that I have to restore the building to what it was before there was a vault. That would cost a fortune." The a-hole landlord says if I leave the vault behind when I move, that he'll sue. That's when I tell him, "Send your lease up to my office and let me look it over." I then finished my lunch, and when I got back to my office, the lease was waiting for me. It was just as bad as the restaurant owner said it was. The lease was a renewal of an assignment of a renewal, and the original documents dated back to shortly after World War II, when the bank first leased the place and the vault was installed. Somehow the landlord had suckered the restaurant into taking over a lease that left him liable to remove the bank vault at the end of term. No big deal, I thought. The restaurant can default, and all the landlord can do is sue a shell company. But that's what I thought. When I got to the last page of the lease, there was a guarantee clause. The restaurant owner had personally guaranteed the lease, and he was on the hook for removing a vault weighing 100 tons, and then fixing the place up. It would cost a fortune. The case was hopeless, of course. That was obvious right away. But then I thought about the a-hole landlord with his demands and his threats and his rent hikes, and I asked my brain to do me a solid, which it promptly did. I picked up the phone and called the restaurant owner. The first thing he says is, "I'm effed, right? You're calling me to say there's no way out." That's what my commercial lawyer already said, but I thought I'd ask. That's when I tell him, "I can save you, but it's gonna cost." He asked me, "How much?" I respond, $5,000 in legals and another G-note for the agent. The restaurant owner asked, "Agent? What kind of agent?" I tell him, "Real estate. Just send up a check, certified, and leave the rest to me." The check hit my desk in less than 1 hour. I then went to Aaron's office and said, "Hey, I need a real estate agent." Aaron asked, "Are you buying a house?" I tell him, "Nope." "Are you selling a house?" Another nope. By this point, I'd been sharing space with Aaron for almost 5 years, and he knew me pretty well. He then said to me, "Oh, so you're pulling one of your stunts again?" I tell him yes, but nothing that'll get you in trouble. Aaron tells me I know a guy, and Aaron knows all kinds of guys, and that's one of the reasons he eventually got disbarred. But he knew a guy, and he gave me the agent's name and number, and the next day I paid the agent a visit. I told him what I needed, and we agreed to terms. I then gave him some papers and the cash for his fee. A few days later, I was again at the vault for lunch. The owner saw me walking in, and he greeted me himself. He said to me, "The landlord's here." I ask, "Why?" He then tells me, "For lunch, and to be an a-hole. Let's sit in the vault room so I don't have to look at his face." He then took me to the vault room with the door almost completely closed, and we had a consultation while we ate pasta and drank red wine. I tell the owner we're making demand on the landlord while munching on spaghetti. He says, "Demand? What are we demanding?" I then pull out a document out of my briefcase and passed it to him while I sipped on my wine. I say to him, "We're demanding that the a-hole landlord release all the restaurant equipment, all the fixtures, the ovens, the freezers, the ventilation, everything you need to run a restaurant." The restaurant owner says, "The lease exempts all that stuff. He can't stop me taking what I want. The only thing that matters is the vault, and of course I don't want that." I then shook my head and said, "You need the vault." And we're demanding that he release the bank vault as well. We're insisting that he let you take it out within 7 business days. Hearing that, the owner was shocked. He said to me, "You think you can beat the landlord with reverse psychology? You think if you treat him like a 2-year-old that you can manipulate him into doing what you want?" I tell him we'll find out soon enough. He's had the demand for a couple of days now. The restaurant owner dropped his wine glass and it shattered on the marble floor. He then said to me, "You already gave it to him?" He then got up, swung the vault door open, and called the waiter to clean up the mess. I then tell him, "Let's see what the landlord has to say." And that's when we walked over to the landlord's table. The landlord was a big, beefy man with a big appetite. The guy sat alone, eating a rack of lamb wolfishly with his hands. I walk up to him and say, "My client needs an answer today." The landlord looked up at me as he chewed noisily. I then say, "I'm the vault's lawyer. I gave you a demand the other day, and my client needs an answer right now. He needs the vault for a new place, and he's gotta make arrangements." The landlord then says to me, "Your client can forget about the bank vault," while wiping his massive greasy hands on his soiled napkin. I say to him, "But you can't do that." Now, my shock was feigned, but the restaurant owner's jaw dropped for real. The landlord then laughed at us and said, "I'm the landlord. I can do what I want." To which I respond, "I'm gonna need that in writing because my client might sue." He tells me, "Sue all you like. Sue until you're blue in the face. In fact, I dare you to sue me." He then told me that I would have a formal response by the day's end, and he told me to go away and let him finish his lunch. When the letter arrived from the landlord claiming ownership over the bank vault, I brought it downstairs and showed it to my client. He said to me, "How the hell did you do that?" I tell him, "Trade secret." The following month, the restaurant moved out and the place was empty. And that was too bad because I always enjoyed eating at the vault. Now the restaurant was in a new location 20 minutes away. They called the new place the Vault, and they preserved the vibe of the old place. It was very similar, except they didn't have a bank vault. The bank vault, all 100 tons of it, was where it's always been, in the basement of the building where I rented space. I showed up for work a little after that, and Aaron collared me and said, "The landlord's looking for you." I just say, "Oh yeah, what about?" He tells me the guy's really angry. He said his deal fell through. I ask, "Deal?" Aaron tells me he was supposed to rent the place downstairs to a new tenant, a bank or a credit union or something like that. They were supposed to come sign a lease, but they didn't show up. I said to Aaron, "And what's that got to do with me?" And I said the same thing again to the landlord when he managed to track me down a couple of days later. The landlord says to me, "I knew you were behind this." He said it to me with his jowls quivering. He said, "I know it was you. That offer from the agent, it was all BS, just a trick to make me keep the vault, so that your client could sneak out of the place and leave that effing bank vault. I'm gonna sue." I just tell him, "If you're looking for counsel, I think you're gonna have to declare a conflict." He then says to me, "I'm gonna sue the restaurant, I'm gonna sue that agent, and I'm gonna sue you." He then stormed off. But the landlord did not sue. Of course he didn't. He didn't have a contract to sue on, only a vague letter of intent that I drafted. Enough to hook a greedy landlord who was used to having it his way. The offer he received was non-binding, incapable of acceptance without signing a formal lease, which of course never got signed. When I left Aaron's place a year later, the downstairs was still unoccupied, with a sad sign that said "For rent" sitting in the window that started to look faded. Holy moly, was that revenge ever freaking sweet, guys. And this is why you don't mess with some lawyers, because some of them are way too crafty, like absolutely brilliant what OP did. That was like some Saul Goodman stuff. And I'm all here for that crafty, lowbrow lawyer stuff, guys. It's very, very entertaining. With that said, always read the contract thoroughly, right? Like, if the restaurant owner knew he was responsible for the removal of the vault when it was time to leave, maybe he would have thought twice about renting the place to begin with. And none of this would have had to happen. Nonetheless, OP came in and saved the day for sure. So my first husband was not a very nice man. For 6 years, I was belittled and basically a baby factory for him. He was a fantastic father, but a horrible husband. After he finally got his heirs, I was then treated even worse, until I finally woke up and decided to leave his ass. But this revenge story is not about him, I just had to set the scene. I moved out of the house, taking my clothes, the car, and a computer. I had nothing. I stayed at a girlfriend's for a couple of weeks before I was able to line up a crappy townhouse with roommates. I had no furniture, and my bed was a cat pee smelling free couch that I was able to score. I wound up having 3 to 4 jobs, with one of them being full-time, and once a week I would not even be able to sleep a night between jobs. Now, fast forward 1 year. My divorce was finalized, and I'd fulfilled my year's lease for the townhouse. By this time, from all my hard work, I had furnished my home, my bedroom, and my kids' room when they would be with me for visitation. The scumbag landlord was a nice-ish landlord during the time of my tenancy, and I was a good tenant, never being late with my rent. Although I had roommates, I was the sole name on the lease. The landlord would show up often, with some guise like he had to work on something like plumbing tests or whatever excuse he could come up with so he could be all creepy and hang around, trying to converse with me. That made me quite uneasy at times. Finally, the lease was fulfilled, and I was on a month-to-month contract, which at the time, I was ready to move out of this crappy townhouse. I found a great house in the mountains nearby, and I was simply thrilled now that I had finally got my feet on the ground, and I could afford a bit better than slum living. My lease stated that I had to give 1 month's notice in order to move out. Unfortunately, I was able to get the house I was to move into for the next month, only 3 weeks away. So I send my landlord a letter stating that I intend on moving out at the end of the month, in 3 weeks, and he can try and find another tenant. But I did state that if he didn't find another tenant, that I would still fulfill my legal obligation and pay next month's rent. Within 1 week, 2 weeks before I was to move out, he emailed back and stated that was very generous of my offer, but he was able to find a new tenant for the beginning of the next month, and I would be off the hook. He even tipped his hand by stating that he collected a deposit from them. Now, something happened within a couple of days after, which was no fault of my own, nor my roommates. The townhouse came with its own appliances, fridge, oven, etc., including a clothes washer and dryer on the main level. My roommate had put a load of laundry in, and he went to the living room to have a nap. Well, he awoke to find that the washer had malfunctioned with the sensory switch, which never stopped the water fill stage, and there was an inch of water in the kitchen and living room. He splashed through the water to turn off the washer, and he called me to come help deal with this. I was just getting off of work, and I whipped home to assess the damage, and it was bad. There was standing water on top of the living room carpet and a good inch of water in the whole kitchen. So I call my landlord and tell him the issue. By the time the landlord showed up, I had already got most of the standing water out with the help of my roommate and his friends that showed up with shop vacs. The landlord did not seem too upset, which was surprising for me, and he had an appliance repairman come look at the washer. The repairman even said, "Yep, here's the culprit," and showed how the dial would stick on the fill stage and wouldn't click over to the agitate stage. And after replacing the dial and lubricating the whole deal, he left. The next week was chaos, as I was busy trying to pack, and landlord had insurance guys in assessing, and also he had workers taking out the carpet and cutting 2 feet worth of the lower drywall of the whole main level. The day of the move, though I was still supposed to be there for a couple of more days, landlord had let himself in, as movers were moving out my stuff. The guy came in with a camera, going around taking pictures of everything. I honestly thought that it was for his insurance claims, etc. I actually felt bad for landlord, and I told him that I would not ask for my deposit back. And he responded in front of the loading crew and my roommate, "Thank you, that's very generous of you." We then part ways, and I thought that was that, but boy was I wrong. 2 weeks into my new home location, landlord shows up on my doorstep with a summons to appear in arbitration because the guy was suing me. And I'm thinking, what? On what grounds? He then stated it's all in the paperwork, and he hands me a manila envelope with 18 pages of everything he was charging me with, all including photos. Now I know why he was going around taking pictures. The guy was nickel and diming me on everything from a bent Venetian blind, some scuffs on the walls, etc, etc. But he also wanted me to pay his insurance deductible and that following month's rent. The guy claimed that the tenants he had lined up backed out last minute, claiming they didn't think the place would be ready in time with the new drywall, paint, and so on. So he wanted me to pay that month's rent. And I'm thinking, really? F that. I knew I was more than generous of giving him my whole deposit. And then for him to come back and sue me for thousands of dollars? The guy was not only claiming damages caused by the flood, but improvements he needed to do that should never be or have been my responsibility in the first place. The guy even stated that cracks in the wall that was from the building settling I was responsible for. Like, how should I be responsible for that? Even new lighting, all faucets, etc. All mainly on the accusation that I was negligent, and I wasn't gonna have that. Now, I knew this was a slummy townhouse complex and most of its tenants were on welfare. And maybe he could get away with doing that to others, but not me. No way. I had just got out of a marriage that made me feel insignificant, and I had horrible self-esteem. But now I had my dignity, and I felt strong for the first time in a long time. There was no way I was gonna let any more stuff happen to me without my doing something about it. I had 10 days before the date of my arbitration meeting. So with that, I immediately get to work. First, getting a signed deposition from the very repairman that had showed up that day, stating the appliance was quite in need of maintenance work, and the last time he had done any maintenance for him was almost 5 years before. From thoroughly reviewing my rental contract and local laws, landlords obligated to have all appliances maintained and serviced every year. I had also talked to some of the other tenants, and I had heard that this wasn't the first time he had sued tenants after the fact. So I hunted them down and got sworn statements from them also. Unfortunately for them, they did not know what to do, and mostly didn't show up at arbitration, hence landlord winning by default. And there was no way I was gonna let him do that to me. I then drew up a rebuttal to each and every claim he had, including photos from the year I lived there, printed out all my email correspondence, and even convinced my ex-roommate and one of the movers that heard my interaction with him about him stating how generous it was me letting him keep my whole deposit, which was a significant amount. So on the day of arbitration, I dressed up in my power suit, and with my ex-roommate and worker in tow, I showed up at the meeting. Now, in Canada, arbitration's not held in a courtroom per se. It's held at the courthouse in a conference room with a judge. We had 1 hour with the judge. Since landlord was the plaintiff, he got to go first with the case. The guy spent over 40 minutes going over everything, and I sat quietly until he finished. Once he finished, I then hauled out the rebuttal in multiple copies, handed one to the judge, to the landlord, and anyone else that wished to have one, and I quickly went over each point. The landlord was irate and interrupted almost every second sentence I spoke. I would pause the moment he'd start talking, and I would say sweetly, "I was quiet and polite during your time to present your case. I hope you grant me the same respect." The landlord starts to get red in the face, especially when I got the deposition of the maintenance worker for the appliance. I included with that the Tenancy and Landlord Act sections pertaining to appliance maintenance, and stated that this was the only record of maintenance that had occurred, and unless he can come up with more recent records from perhaps another company, it was over 5 years since anything had been looked at. With my defense, I had also then countered that I would like my deposit back and my day's pay from work, since I had to take that day off to go to this meeting. The judge then made his statement, and I will always remember this for the rest of my life. The judge stated that first, he was very impressed of my presentation, and that I obviously have a good handle on things, and he can tell that my nature is of kindness and respect, especially with the photos of how I had the townhouse furnished and clean. So the bottom line is, not only did I win my case, I wound up having the landlord owing me over 80% of my deposit back, including interest. And the guy's face was absolutely priceless. The judge then proceeded to tell the landlord that they'll be reviewing again all his previous filings, and if there was enough evidence of harassment, he would be reported to the board of landlords and tenants. I don't really know if anything came of that. Now, I walked away that day feeling on top of the world, completely justified that he got a taste of his own medicine. But it didn't stop there. Oh no. So knowing this guy has a history of suing tenants, I printed up my final results and the judge's signature. And I gave a copy to each and every tenant in that complex. I wanted to warn everyone of his practices and to keep notes, photos, etc. so he couldn't do that to them. But I didn't stop there. The guy now owed me money, and I asked repeatedly for the payment. The guy never responded. The guy had until a certain day to pay me back my deposit, and on that day, I went to his house. I knocked on the door, and the guy did not answer, though I know he was home. I rang the bell a few more times and then knocked loudly. The guy then turned his house alarm on, which at first startled me but quickly turned to humor, seeing how much of a pussycat this bully turned out to be. I then yelled out loud that I'm not going anywhere, and he yelled, "Get off my property or I'll call the police." And I'm thinking, okay, no problem. I got off the property but camped out on the front sidewalk. I had a fold-up chair, a cooler with water and sodas, a few sandwiches, and all my paperwork with me. I was set to stay there forever. I then would tell anyone that would walk by about how I was a tenant and he wrongfully sued me and that I have a claim against him and now he owes me money. I just let anyone look at the paperwork just to back up my claim, and the police did show up. They first went to talk to the landlord, as he was claiming that I was harassing him, slandering him, and I wouldn't leave his property. Well, I was on the public sidewalk, and it's not slander if it's true, of which I had all my court-signed documents to back me up. I wasn't disturbing the peace. I was simply and quietly seated outside his home and just talking to neighbors about his actions. The guy was out yelling that I need to leave, and I quietly stated that I would be happy to leave once I'm paid. That I was not going to leave before I got money in my hand, and I was more than willing to stay there and tell anyone that would listen to me why I was camped out. The police stated that I wasn't doing anything wrong, that it's public property and I wasn't disturbing the peace, and it's not slander if it's true. Finally, after an hour of the guy yelling on his front lawn at the policeman, and at me of course, his wife came out with money. She handed the money to the police, and then they handed it to me, and signed off, documenting final payment was complete. I just sweetly smiled, thanked the police deeply, and then went home. I have no idea whatever happened to this guy, but I just want to say that sometimes nice guys or girls finish last, but with patience, they will finish with a win. Guys, I absolutely love stories where sleazy landlords like this get what they deserve. And after hearing how he basically bullied low-income families into submission by threatening court, it just makes this revenge so much sweeter. Way to freaking go, OP. Again, this is why you treat everyone the way you'd want to be treated, because you never ever know who you're messing with and who will stand up to you. And that, my friends, brings us to another end of r/ProRevenge. Guys, I hope you enjoyed today's stories. If you did, hit that thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing so you don't miss these crazy stories. And if you missed yesterday's episode on the channel, it's an r/entitled People episode, where a psycho Karen family demands OP's baby because they need a baby girl. It's such a ridiculous story, so go check it out if you haven't. And myself and Stevie Boy will see you guys in the next one. We love you.